What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back with another Detroit Lions cuts update video, man. This is basically a part 2 to what we did yesterday, going through the cuts as we continue to work down to this 53-man roster for the Lions that is now due by tomorrow, 4 p.m. Eastern time. We'll know officially what this 53-man roster is looking like. But we got some notes today from Dan Campbell. He spoke to the media, which was good. He gave us some really good updates, as well as some more cuts that have went down and were announced today. Now, I'm going to call this kind of the second wave, though by the time I put this video out there, I'm sure there'll probably be something else that pops up. But very recently, there was a move that was made, and I think it's one of the potential bigger ones. So I thought this would be a good time to step in and say, okay, we'll call this the second wave of cuts, and then we'll just kind of see what happens. But there are a couple of things that I definitely want to talk about in this video, so let's get it started. Welcome everybody to a video. Glad you guys are here, and yes, man, now this one we have a few less players to talk about here. And again, I don't know if there's a ton of like, wow, that's super shocking that this guy got let go, but there is one that just happened pretty recently, and I don't know that it's necessarily a major shock, but I think it's an interesting talking point when you look at the Lions roster situation tied together with what we heard from Dan Campbell. So I think there's a couple things that I want to talk about in today's video. We know there's been rumors flying around out there. The Lions are going to add this guy, this guy. Dan Campbell basically clarified that today. Not necessarily I'm saying a trade, but clarified that, yeah, you know, you have your eyes on players from other teams if you think they can upgrade. So that's something that you kind of are working with, while at the same time trying to manage how many players that you have on that roster. Maybe you have to leave a spot open for someone that you want to bring in there. He did talk about the value of having players return to the practice squad that are familiar. You kind of know what they're going to do. You know how they're going to fit. They understand the terminology. And I thought one of the most interesting things that he said was he doesn't even really look at it like a 53-man roster. It's really like a 69-man team. Last couple of years when we've been following this, I think you're seeing a lot of this happen every single year where you're getting a lot of those players back that you end up not making the 53, that you're like, oh wow, that guy did not make the 53. They ultimately just end up right back on the practice squad. Now there's always a couple, there usually is a couple that you're like, oh, we weren't able to get him back and maybe he went elsewhere, or usually you add different names as well to your practice squad. Like you'll get a couple new pieces that may be less and less as we continue to build and we're having some of that continuity, right? The same kind of players here. So we may get less and less of that. I'm sure we'll still get new additions to the practice squad that we did not see on our team in the preseason that was probably elsewhere. So that'll continue to happen, just maybe at a smaller rate. But I thought this was a very interesting point by Dan Campbell because it does seem pretty true. Now again, there's that risk that you could lose a player, and that's something that I think you also have to manage. But at the same time, with the flexibility now within the practice squad, of course you can protect players, being able to put veterans on the practice squad. It does feel like a lot of those guys that you're unable to keep ultimately just end up back there. And then I think he said something that was very important, is that, hey, we look at those guys like you're still part of the team. You're probably at some point going to be asked to play. Maybe not everybody. Like, for example, if you looked at Lions last year's practice squad, I don't think everybody played on the practice squad last year. Example will be an Eze in any regular season game for us this past year. But a lot of those guys do play. So, again, I think that's something that we could really look at, especially this year when you start to look at individual positions, for example, running back, where the Lions may go a little bit lighter there. That's kind of my expectation. You're still probably going to add someone to the practice squad. So even if you're not holding them on the 53-man roster, probably going to have at least one player on the practice squad that you feel good about elevating for a game situation. So I think those were two really good points by Dan Campbell. Well, with that being said, we'll revisit some of the other notes from Dan Campbell. Let's talk about the cuts that were announced today. And we'll start with the most recent one, probably the one that is slightly on the more surprising side. Again, I'm not shocked by this move, but I think it does bring up an interesting conversation about the rest of the positional group. And that is that the Detroit Lions are reportedly waiving cornerback Chase Lucas. Now, after the third and final preseason game, I ended up kind of talking myself into putting Chase Lucas into my 53-man roster prediction, saying that he was going to end up making the team and that the Lions were going to just hold a lot of cornerbacks and basically just have to cut elsewhere. But the Lions have decided against that. Now, I really hope that we can somehow get Chase Lucas back. I still want to keep this guy around. And again, I think Chase Lucas, the lack of flexibility specifically in terms of his ability to play different positions for the Lions defensively, we just really haven't seen that. And it's not just that he hasn't played other positions, it's that his skill set doesn't really match up for a ton of different positions within our defense. I kind of came to the thought that with the UDFAs, if we were going to go really heavy at the cornerback position, maybe he wouldn't have to necessarily have a ton of versatility because we had other guys that we felt confident could play on the outside. But Apparently not. Chase Lucas has been waived by the Lions. But here's the most interesting point to this, and it may have nothing to do with it at all. It could just be, hey, they waived the player. But I think one of the most interesting points here is an Emmanuel Moseley, who Dan Campbell told us today is someone that they were going to have to make a decision on tonight, whether to put him on that PUP list, right, and then he misses the first 4 games of the season, or to basically put him on that 53-man roster and allow him to play. He's close. And I think just the fact that Dan Campbell said that they were going to have that discussion tonight tells you a lot of positive about where Emmanuel Moseley is. Recently, we've gotten some good updates in practice. We just still haven't seen him yet. We know that when he's healthy, he's going to be on the 53, right? Now, starting, I don't know that he starts week 1, for example, if he was on the 53. They may go Jerry, Cam, and kind of work him into it, but we know he's going to be on the 53. So could this mean that Moseley is actually going to be on the team to start the season and not on the PUP list? So when you look at the guys that still currently are here, and we'll have to keep an eye on where this goes, of course, we still have the UDFAs who have not been let go yet, Starling Thomas and Stephen Gilmore. Khalil Dorsey is also still on the roster. I don't think he's going to make it, but Khalil Dorsey does bring flexibility. He played mainly on the outside for us in this year's preseason, but he played really well, improved every game, and by the time you got to the final preseason game, Khalil Dorsey was getting the top reps. Now, obviously, there was a lot of guys that just weren't playing, and they were rotating a lot of pieces in a lot of different spots, but he improved every game. He played well really in every game. Anytime he was targeted, he had success. He played well against the run. He showed really good recognition, and again, he has a history of being able to play inside, outside, and he's played in NFL games. He's a very interesting option, and I still feel like he probably won't make the roster. Hopefully, if not, he gets on the practice squad, but I think that's a really interesting name to keep an eye on, as well as Will Harris, and it took me until the last day of the preseason where I ultimately took him out because I went with Matt Nelson, although the Detroit Lions decided to let go of Jermaine Ifedi. Now, still technically, I believe we have these 10 offensive linemen on the team, Brad Cecile, Max Percher, but according to Dave Burkett, he made it sound like there was kind of a cutoff with 8 offensive linemen after Matt Nelson, and I would be pretty shocked if Brad Cecile and Max Percher made the team, to be honest with you. I think that's, if anything, try to take a look at a different offensive lineman if something becomes available. I didn't see a lot of names that necessarily stood out at quick glance with some of the free agents that have been let go, but that's still taking place. So I don't necessarily think either of those guys would. I guess if either of them, maybe Brad Cecile because he's place a center position, but either way, I'd be pretty shocked either of them made the final roster, so I think that's going to be cut down to 8, but because of that, it was a big reason that I ended up not keeping Will Harris is because I went with 9 offensive linemen, really just kind of leading into predicting that. But if the Lions go with 8, Will Harris could absolutely have a spot, and we know the Lions like Will Harris. I like Will Harris. I like his flexibility. We play outside safety slot. He talks about having to prepare for all of that every single game. I'm a fan of Will Harris, and I think the Lions definitely like him too. So it absolutely could mean that he ends up making the 53, and I'm absolutely okay with that if that is the case. Of course, I would have liked to keep Chase Lucas because he was still on that rookie deal, and I do worry about him not making it back to the Lions. But I guess we'll just keep an eye on that and see what happens. I think the toughest thing there for Lucas is that he helped himself a lot on day 3. So for other teams in the league, absolutely could put a claim in. Like, I don't know why you wouldn't put a claim in for Chase Lucas if you feel like you need a potential type of nickel corner. But we'll see. We know that those guys, if they don't bring a ton of flexibility and that vision necessarily isn't there, especially for him, he's a little bit of an older player as well, guys tend to not necessarily get the same value. So it is something to keep an eye on there. But I think that's very interesting. Very curious to see what happens with Emmanuel Moseley. All right, let's fly through some of these other moves. Hendon Hooker is going to be placed on the reserved NFI list, which is something that was kind of expected. Right there, you can see it at the bottom. So he'll be out for the first 6 weeks, then he'll have that 3-week window to potentially return. Something to keep an eye on. Now, speaking about the quarterback position, Nate Sudfeld reportedly, I saw this according to Bleacher Report, is going to be out for the season with an ACL tear. That's absolutely terrible. Dan Campbell talked about it, how unfortunate it is for him. They liked him enough what they saw last year to bring him back, right? To bring him back for this season. I think they looked at him as really a good spot for kind of that emergency quarterback. They said they feel good about Bridgewater, so he kind of made it sound like there was a competition, but we knew Bridgewater was going to be the backup when he signed, but it is still something the Lions will have to figure out on and who is going to be that piece. Colt McCoy just got let go, but I don't know that that guy gets brought in to be that role. Adrian Martinez was waived today, so maybe a guy like Martinez, I mean, he seems to make the most sense to potentially stick into that role. I still have to talk about this year's sponsor for the football season. I'm very excited about this, and I really appreciate this opportunity. We have partnered with BetUS, man, and BetUS is a leading online betting platform that offers a wide range of sports betting and casino games. Now, BetUS has a reputation for the reliability their security, and their excellent customer service, and there's a lot of ways to get in touch with them. And it's very easy to sign up. So all you have to do is click the top link in the description. They're hooking you up with some nice bonuses. So if you click that link top of the description, you can claim some nice bonuses. All you have to do is sign up. It's like 2 pages, very easy to sign up. Then you can claim your bonus. You can see there's multiple different bonus options. You make your deposit, and if you make a minimum $100 deposit, you can get a 125% match on that deposit. So they're hooking you up. BetUS has a lot of different ways to bet. So it's not just football. I mean, they hit on all the major sports: football, basketball, baseball, soccer. I mean, hey, if you're into soccer, there you go. Heck, they got esports on here, man. There's tons of different ways to do it, whether that's, game props, pre-game betting, whether that's over-unders, whether that's future bets, live betting as well, including parlays, so you can build out your ticket and do things that way. If you're a returning member, there are 5 currently re-up promotions. There are 6 listed currently sign-up promotions. Through BetUS, you become a loyal member to BetUS, and this leads to other perks, including free payouts, free monthly tournament entries, bigger bonuses. I want to shout out to BetUS. I'll have something very creative going forward for this, but for now, shout out to BetUS. The other big surprise here is probably Dylan Drummond, the receiver. Again, I didn't have him in my 53-man roster. I think the biggest and most interesting thing to this, and you've probably seen the rumors, is the Lions potentially looking to go add a receiver, not just necessarily in terms of a signing to the practice squad, something like that, but maybe even a trade. And I know you guys have seen all the Mike Evans videos and things like that. I don't know if it's true or not. I have no idea. But if the Lions went that route, of course, they may want to open up that roster spot. If you go based on what Dan Campbell said, you got to be prepared for those things. Maybe that's the way they decide to lean into. But before we do that, obviously Chase Cota and Maurice Alexander are still on the roster as of this moment that I'm speaking. I think there's still a shot there for Chase Cota to slide into this as kind of like the 6th receiver. And then a guy like Maurice Alexander, I'd be pretty surprised if he made the team, just because the impact offensively wasn't necessarily there. Now again, he had a pretty strong finish. In the final preseason game was a pretty strong finish for him. Obviously he had the big return. The other ones weren't so great, but he had the big punt return for a touchdown to score a first touchdown of the preseason, so he wouldn't be like our top punt returner. I expect that to be Khalif, unless they want to just really take that role off of his shoulders, because like, hey, Khalif's going to do more for us offensively. Maybe that's a possibility. I'd be surprised if Maurice Alexander made the team, but he is still here, and there is a shot that something like that could take place. But again, back to really the Mike Evans thing, because that's the thing that I've heard the most here. I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but I will at least touch on the topic. If the Detroit Lions were realistically interested in Mike Evans, why this could make sense. Well, here's the situation. Mike Evans is on the final year of his contract. If you don't know who I'm talking about, well, you know who I'm talking about, right? It's the big receiver. It's the big guy from Tampa Bay, the guy that puts up 1,000 yards every single season. You guys know who I'm talking about, but I'm saying this because it may sound weird that I'm talking about a guy of this caliber. Like, wait a minute, where did this come from? I've seen the rumors too. I don't know exactly where this is coming from. Obviously, it looks like Tampa Bay's in a position where they may look to sell a couple of their assets. So if the price lines up, maybe Lions are actually interested in this. Because Mike Evans is on the final year of his contract, according to Over the Cap, if a trade was made, we'd be looking at taking on a cap hit a little over $14 million. First off, the Lions have cap space. They have some of the most cap space currently in the league right now, near $20 million according to Over the Cap. Now, things will shake up a little bit with some of these roster moves, but the Lions would financially be able to make it happen. Of course, there'd be a question for a guy that's going into 31 years old about, hey, what do we do beyond this, right? Do we look for a contract extension here if you bring in that type of receiver? And that would be something that I wouldn't really know for sure. Maybe this like a extra year would be added on top of it. He's already got a void year next year, over $12 million, but maybe an extra year that you would trade and then sign him to a short little extension.
And I think we talked about something kind of similar here with Cooper Kupp. Now, of course, you'd have more flexibility trying to make those decisions if it was a Mike Evans, because this is his last year of his contract. But when you look at it, the effective cap space, now some of these numbers are a little bit tweaked because this video is a little bit older, but when you take a look at the effective cap space the Lions have over the next couple of seasons, when you take a look at some of their upcoming contracts, first off, you just take a look at the receiver room. Antoine Green, rookie deal. Jamison Williams won't kick in. You look at an Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is the closest to having to get paid. Amon-Ra St. Brown can begin to negotiate after the season, as he was part of that first draft class, but even still, his cap hit would not necessarily kick in until really that 2025 season, and that's assuming that you don't backload that type of contract. And really, again, that's the first draft class for the Lions, so a lot of those guys, the Ely McNeils, the guys that we expect to get paid, Levi maybe throws himself into that category, right? A Penei Sewell, who has a 5th-year option, which could push it back a little bit further. Those players, again, their cap numbers would not start really taking effect hopefully until really that 2025 season and beyond, unless, of course, you extend them early and then just decide to push up early in their contract, which wouldn't make a ton of sense. So there is real flexibility there, not only in the receiver under contract. Khalif Raymond did get his extension, which is one of the differences between now and when this little graphic was built here. So he is someone that would be under contract for the next couple of seasons now. But also, you take a look, again, a lot of rookie deals there, but a Marvin Jones Jr., a Josh Reynolds, they're on the final year of their contract, and those are your big outside receivers. So you're talking about just a guy that's kind of close in terms of body type and role for the Lions. Again, you would be adding a piece in Mike Evans if he had that extension to what you would be missing. Now he would be under contract potentially for those years or for next season exactly, and then you would have that body type under contract and you wouldn't have to necessarily worry about it. So the flexibility, it makes a ton of sense.
But, and I won't go super deep here on Mike Evans because we just know that he's a top tier receiver, and I haven't heard enough of the rumor stuff to say like, oh, this is like legitimately a possibility, but I have heard like rumblings of it. So today I went and checked out some Mike Evans, right? Just to kind of refresh. Like, I know what Mike Evans is about. We see the stats. The guy is reliable. He's always healthy for the most part. He doesn't miss a lot of time, and that's a big part of why every single season he puts up 1,000 yards. He also brings a lot of the size that the Detroit Lions kind of had there with Denzel Mims. Of course, Denzel Mims was not a proven player, but for what the Lions seemingly wanted there, size, speed, of course, what they look for were some of these outside receiving targets. The Lions have some size and they have some speed with Josh Reynolds and with Marvin Jones Jr., but they don't necessarily have like a ton of those like bigger, more built kind of receivers. Mike Evans would kind of give you a little bit more of that if you had that kind of addition. We talked about the consistency in terms of production, the touchdowns, the yards per reception, where that's pushing over 15 yards per reception on his entire career, still 14.6 this past season. And just from doing a quick little watch, looking at some of his games from this past season or 2022 where he had Tom Brady, so it's going to probably look a lot different this year, but just looking at some of those things, man, you're really impressed by a guy that's that big, right? For a guy that's 30 years old at that size, the juice that he has off the line of scrimmage, the ability to separate, the acceleration off the line, the ability to win on the ball, the flexibility he plays in the slot, plays on the outside, moves around a ton. There's real run after catch upside once the ball gets in his hands. The flexibility as a route runner. You love the dominance when he's attacking, a blind spot of a corner, whether it's off coverage. He's seen all the looks there, but there's flexibility. He runs a pretty deep route tree because his route running is good, man. He's flexible. He's lean. He can dip, break, come in and out of breaks really well. He's got a lot of juice in his game for a guy at that size. He uses his hands well. Of course, he just has the physicality there. So from just watching it pretty quickly, and obviously if the Lions made something like this, that'd be a huge video that we would do. But I gotta say, if something went down like this, trust me, I would be pretty happy because this is a disgusting receiver. Oh my goodness. Like, you hear about these guys, you see the numbers. When you actually start watching them, you're like, this dude's a little different. And if the Lions were really interested, then you could understand it. Josh Reynolds has kind of been like a 500-yard type of receiver for the Lions, which is great. He's got a good role. We know the deep outs, the deep comeback routes, right? He plays a good role for this Lions offense, the play action shots. Marvin Jones Jr., I think, opens up a lot of the contested wins, back shoulder, dig routes, those kind of things. But Mike Evans brings a full route tree that can line different positions. That's a just incredible athlete across the board. That's extremely productive. Don't really have to worry about, like, is he going to be out there for us this week? Extremely reliable. You really can't go wrong with a player like that. And it does match up with the Lions financially and with where his current contract situation is. So it is something to keep an eye on. I'm just saying. Look, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think it is something to keep an eye on. Continuing, we'll just kind of touch on some of these other moves here. Players that were also announced waived today. Connor Galvin, the offensive tackle, was waived today. Ryan Swoboda, the offensive tackle. Two guys that were kind of playing near the bottom of the depth chart for the Lions in the preseason. I saw Swoboda put together a really good second game in a very minimal type of role, and it had me intrigued for week 3, and then it didn't necessarily live up to that hope that I necessarily had for him into that game. KO'd, who I think he just had a tough preseason. Now, he did some good for us last season in terms of at times you'd like the way that he was able to step in. I think he's one of the better pulling offensive linemen that we have for all those power plays that we like to utilize. However, the downside is for KO'd is we talk about consistency a lot for offensive linemen, but that is the case there for KO'd in terms of pass protection, in terms of really staying on his feet as a blocker. And for KO'd, I don't think he put together that strong of a preseason. And on top of that, he was a guy that was involved in Bobby Hart, who stepped in to a higher role in week number 2 after a rough week 1. KO'd actually went down the depth chart so Bobby Hart could step into a bigger role. That was ultimately kind of brought back, but that did happen, and KO'd was directly involved in that. So again, that one kind of just makes sense to me. June Okwara, who's dealing with a little bit of an injury, who did not come back in this last game. We feel like he's sort of on this roster bubble, but I ultimately do think that he's going going to end up making the team. The injuries, of course, don't help him because he's had to deal with that outside of just consistency on the field, but I think he's going to end up making it. I really don't feel confident that guy gets back if the Lions decide to make that kind of cut there. Also, Iffy, who he spoke on, the safety that we know has had some injury history. He also has been injured recently for the Lions there. He said that Iffy, basically right now, they're just kind of taking it day to day. He said today that he would not practice. We talk about depth there at safety. It's a real reason the Lions could look to add it or keep a fifth safety. It's also a real reason that whoever lands back on the practice squad at that position could be very important for the Lions. We know there's flexibility. A lot of those corners can do it. Will Harris can do it. They could really be looking at that saying, man, Will Harris can play safety. Even though we haven't really seen it recently, we know that he can. We know that he prepares for it. They could really be looking at, man, that flexibility could be very important for us this upcoming season. Emmanuel Moseley, they're going to have to make a decision on, so we'll figure out what that is. I really want to see him on the 53 because I really want to see him play early for the Lions. I want to see him get going early, like as early as possible. Even if he's not a starter week 1, maybe while week 2, week 3 is in a much bigger role for the Lions. Flip side, though, it's obviously going to impact a lot of these guys on that kind of bubble, specifically at that position. Definitely could impact one of the two to UDFAs in terms of Starling Thomas and Stephen Gilmore. Do they still keep both if Emmanuel Moseley, as I touched on, is brought back? Maybe they do find a way to do that. I mean, I had them keeping Chase Lucas, and now that Chase Lucas is gone, like I said, that could be directly tied to that. And finally, he talked a little bit about preseason decision-making, not playing starters, specifically the first team offense, and he did say that when it kind of comes down to that, you had guys that would ask, he didn't go into specifics there, but he's like, it's specifically on the offensive side of the ball, it's like, hey, if you're playing, then this guy's going to play, and if this guy's going to play, then this guy's got to play, and once you start doing that, either you go all in or you don't do it. And because they had the 2 joint practice sessions throughout the week, and then they play them and they get those live reps during the week, you go back to the first preseason here with Dan Campbell when they did play starters. First off, it was new, but second, on top of that, they didn't have any joint practices. If you remember, Dan Campbell didn't know that he was supposed to schedule those, basically, and he said he would learn from it, and he did. Shout out to Dan Campbell for that. But that was obviously one thing that did show up, and this year they had those joint practices, so he feels comfortable maybe with that. But this is something you hear a lot about quarterback, and it definitely could have been a Jared Goff, because for the quarterback position, most coaches have the same philosophy. If we're going to play him in the preseason, the starting offensive line has to play. We're not putting backup offensive line with a starting quarterback. Makes sense, right? Same thing. They'll want to put the starting receivers probably out there as well. I guess you don't have to, but specifically the offensive line. And if you don't want to put Taylor Decker out there in the preseason, which I would understand, then maybe something like that doesn't necessarily make sense. So with all that being said, those are the updates that we have. We'll keep an eye on it. I'm sure things will continue to pour in, and we'll continue to update this. Tomorrow we'll officially know where the Lions are looking at there, and then it'll start to filling up this practice squad, and we'll start to see how that kind of shapes out. Shout out to our partner for today's video and for this NFL season, BetUS. You can use the link in the description. 100% deposit match for a minimum $100 deposit. Again, you can click that top link, betus.com/DoseOfDion. Thank you, Prop, for watching, and I'm out.